wet March morning in 2023, Glenn Graham eased a 1991 Chevrolet CK pickup into the gravel lot at Mercer Ag Supply outside Terre Haute, Indiana. With rain needling the windshield and rust bubbling over both rear fenders like old paint trying to lift itself free. The odometer had been frozen at 312,406 miles for years. His boots carried black field mud onto the concrete apron. His work coat was faded brown canvas, patched at both elbows with mismatched thread. 3 salesmen near the service desk looked up, then looked back down with the same quick conclusion. Filters, maybe belts, probably on credit. Wade Mercer came out of his glass office in a pressed blue shirt, dealership cap still crisp, clean work boots that had never sunk in spring clay, and the practiced confidence of a man who had closed large notes all week. He walked Glenn past the parts counter and stopped beside a new 310-horsepower tractor, stickered at $412,800. He quoted 7.4% financing over 7 years, then gave the monthly number from memory, $6,316. 24 words later, he gave the total cost over 84 payments, $530,544, and said no one could stay competitive running museum iron. Glenn studied the spec sheet, asked one question about out-the-door pricing with tax and setup, nodded once, thanked him, and walked back into the rain. That was the prevailing misread in Vigo County. Glenn looked like the poorest operator around, farming narrow rented strips, welding his own brackets, hauling grain with a trailer older than most hired hands. Men at coffee counters said he was one hard season from folding, but appearances were giving people bad data. Under those patched sleeves sat 40 years of arithmetic, land bought slowly and paid in full, and one stubborn rule he had built his life around. Do not borrow tomorrow to decorate today. The rule did not come from a book. It came from November 1989 when Glenn was 17 and standing in a cold yard with a duffel bag, $42 in his pocket, and nowhere to go. His stepfather had sold the family hogs, kept the cash, and told him to figure life out somewhere else. Glenn had no truck then. He walked county roads until dark and slept 2 nights in an abandoned machine shed with wind coming through missing boards and a feed sack under his head. On the 3rd afternoon, he took odd work-clearing limbs behind an overgrown hedge grove near a widow's rented field and found what looked like scrap half buried in vines. A 1953 Farmall Super M, engine seized, manifold cracked, 1 rear tire split down to cord. Most people saw weight and rust. Glenn saw sequence. He offered to clear fallen limbs for 3 weekends in exchange for first chance to buy it. The widow agreed. Price, $175. He wrote it in a school notebook he still keeps. First line on the first page of what became his ledger. Farmall Super M, red, not running, bought for labor plus cash. Then he built a repair plan by cost, not hope. Piston rings, $96.40. Rod and main bearings, $148.17. Full gasket set, $63.22. Salvage carburetor from a yard near Clinton, $110. Manifold weld and surface grind paid through labor trade, $0 cash. Oil, coolant, odds and ends, $69.94. Total outlay, $486.73. He did not have that money at once, so he split the purchases by urgency. Bearings first, gaskets second, carburetor last. He swept floors at a machine shop on evenings to settle the headwork. He cleaned every fastener by hand in kerosene and reused what measured within tolerance. By February 1990, the Super M ran rough but steady, blew smoke for the first 2 minutes and then clean enough to work. He found custom disking jobs where larger operators were too busy to bother. 86 acres at $11 per acre. Gross revenue before spring, $946. Fuel and oil cost him $211. Net, $735.27. It was not glamorous. It was survival converted into asset income, and that decision saved his life. By the fall of 1990, he had stacked enough small checks to rent 40 acres at $62 per acre. Cash up front, total $2,480. He planted soybeans on half and corn on half to spread price risk, bought seed in plain bags when neighbors were chasing branded packages with financing plans attached, and kept his variable cost per acre under county average by fixing his own equipment and delaying any purchase that did not produce immediate return. He lived in a one-bedroom farmhouse with a leaking mudroom roof and spent $118 a month on utilities by heating only 3 rooms through winter. Grocery budget that year, $2,340. Clothing, $190. Entertainment, almost nothing. Cash stayed on the farm. From there, his financial growth continued through the same plain arithmetic, repeated season after season. His accumulation from there looked boring year to year and extraordinary in aggregate, which is usually how real wealth appears in agriculture. In 1993, he bought 28 acres from a retiring neighbor for $24,360 cash, which was $870 per acre, when nearby finance sales were already pushing above $1,000 with interest attached. In 1998, he was offered a newer finance tractor for $68,400 at 8.25%. Total payout would have been $90,744. He passed. Instead, he bought a 1974 John Deere 443. For $9,800 cash at auction, and put $2,410 into injectors, hydraulic lines, and tires. Total in the machine, $12,210. Difference versus the financed option, $78,534 saved, before insurance and property tax impacts on newer equipment values. He repeated that pattern until it became identity. Buy late-cycle assets from distressed sales, repair with discipline, pay cash, keep reserves. In 2004, he added 110 acres at $1,920 per acre. Total $211,200, again, no banknote. By 2008, he held 612 acres debt-free and had $184,000 in reserve cash and grain hedges. He still wore patched canvas and still drove old steel. He also had optionality, which is the quiet advantage debt-free operators carry into bad cycles. Wade Mercer kept selling the opposite thesis in those same years. Scale is survival, he said. And on paper, the argument looked modern, efficient, urgent. Good people listened because they were trying to protect their families, not gamble. Glenn did not lecture them. He barely commented. When his nephew asked why he refused easy financing, Glenn gave him one line and then went back to greasing the 4430. Debt is rent paid to fear. By late 2008, if you had passed Glenn on a county road, you would have seen worn overalls in an old truck and guessed strain. What you would have missed was the underlying framework already in place. Paid land, low fixed costs, functional machinery, cash reserves, and a man who had trained himself to treat every dollar as labor stored for later. The county had judged the paint. Glenn had been tracking the balance sheet. By the second week of January 2009, Glenn was back at Mercer Ag Supply with a legal pad folded in his coat pocket and a parts list written in pencil, and the room read him the same way it always had. Rusted pickup outside, faded cap, frayed gloves tucked into his belt. Wade Mercer was standing beside a glossy row crop unit with dealer incentives taped to the windshield, speaking to two operators who both had fresh finance machines and matching jackets with their farm logos stitched in white. Wade saw Glenn, lifted his chin in greeting, and kept his sales rhythm without lowering his voice. He quoted a winter promotion that sounded generous until the numbers were allowed to breathe. Purchase price $286,000. 5-year note at 6.9%. Deferred first payment, estimated annual outflow, $67,904 once principal and interest fully settled. He described it as manageable scale. Then he looked toward Glenn and asked, with a half-smile meant for the room, whether museum iron was still making him money. Glenn answered with 6 words, "Only if the math says yes." He handed the parts clerk a list totaling $1,184.22 for hydraulic hose, bearings, and seals, paid cash, and left with the same unhurried walk he used for every errand. What people missed in moments like that was not only his restraint, it was his operating framework. Glenn never compared a payment to this month's grain check. He compared total cost to productive life, then compared that figure to what used equipment and labor could do at 1/3 the capital burden. That is a non-trivial difference. A finance machine demanded cash whether weather cooperated or not. A paid machine demanded maintenance and skill, both of which he controlled directly. He logged the parts receipt in his pad before turning back toward the yard, where every decision still had to survive the same arithmetics. The ledger that built that arithmetic was not sophisticated on paper. It was a school notebook at first, then binders by decade. Then a clean spreadsheet his nephew eventually entered line by line. The underlying logic never changed. Income by field, expenses by category. Capital purchases only after reserve thresholds were met. Glenn set those thresholds in 1991 and updated them once per decade. Rule 1, 12 months of property tax and insurance and cash before any land purchase. Rule 2, no machinery buy unless repair costs on existing units exceeded replacement economics for 2 consecutive seasons. Rule 3, if grain prices rose, he did not raise lifestyle spending. He raised liquidity. The personal history behind those rules remained mostly unspoken, but it was visible in his spending behavior. He had been removed from home with $42 and no vehicle at 17. And that shock became his baseline for risk. He was never willing to let a bank calendar dictate whether he could keep working. In 1992, when he first cleared more than $20,000 in net farm income, he did not celebrate with a truck. He bought a used gravity wagon for $1,050, set aside $8,400 for future rent, and paid $3,200 in advance on crop insurance because early payment saved 3.5%. That early payment discount was $112. Small number. Repeated across categories, those small numbers became land. There was also one person from those first years who shaped his discipline by example, not speeches. The widow who had sold him the Farmall was named Mabel Klein. She had lost her husband in 1984, kept 49 acres and a house she heated with one wood stove, and kept every tax receipt in shoeboxes by year. She never gave Glenn money. She gave him work and standards. If he repaired fence for her, she checked line tension by hand. If he mowed, she measured strip overlap to make sure fuel was not being wasted. In 1995, when he offered to buy the back 11 acres from her, she agreed at $1,050 per acre, below nearby sales, but wrote one condition into the deed transfer: no borrowing against this ground for equipment. Glenn signed it without hesitation. Mabel moved to Terre Haute in 1999 to be near her sister, and she passed away in 2003. Glenn still keeps her handwritten receipt book in a desk drawer because it reminded him that precision is a form of dignity when cash is limited. By early spring 2009, his discipline was visible in the machinery line itself. The 1953 Farmall Super M remained under a lean-to, no longer primary power but fully operational, after a second overhaul that cost $1,972 in parts spread over 3 winters. The 1974 John Deere 443 carried 11,200 hours and still handled tillage after he rebuilt the hydraulic pump for $780 and replaced rear axle seals for $314. A neighbor paid $312,000 for a newer tractor package that season. Glenn's whole core power lineup, including purchase prices and major repairs, stood at $48,690 total investment. That comparison did not prove everyone with new machinery was reckless. It proved there were multiple viable paradigms, and one carried far less fixed financial stress. He treated auctions the same way. He never attended without a cap price written in advance. In March 2010, he bought a 1988 grain truck for $6,400, then spent $2,260 on brakes, wiring, and tires. Total and service unit, $8,660. Equivalent financed replacement quoted that summer, $71,500 at 7.1% over 6 years. Total payout, $88,220. He wrote the difference in the ledger margin, $79,560, and labeled it Future Acreage. In September 2010, he did exactly that, purchasing 36 acres at $3,050 per acre, total $109,800, funded by reserves plus post-harvest corn sales. His household remained almost aggressively modest because he had decided long ago that comfort and display were different categories. Annual household expenses for 2010 were itemized to the dollar. Utilities, $1,824. Groceries, $3,960. Clothing, $340. Property maintenance on the farmhouse, $1,120. Fuel for personal travel, $1,480. Health insurance premiums, $6,744. Church and local giving, $2,100. Total household spend $17,568. He had the capacity to spend triple that amount by then, but he never saw personal consumption as a meaningful status marker. 3 days after planning wrapped in 2011, his nephew asked him in the machine shed why he still drove the Chevrolet with rust through both wheel arches when cash was no longer tight. Glenn took longer than usual to answer. "New trucks are fine," he said. "Notes are not." Then he showed the nephew a single page from the ledger with a 10-year projection based on one common decision path. Replace truck every 6 years with finance purchases averaging $48,000 at 6.2%, rolling balance each cycle. Total outflow over 30 years, including interest and depreciation losses, approximately $347,000. Keep one truck running, rebuild major components, average annual maintenance, $2,900, then replace once with cash when repairs exceed value. 30-year outflow, approximately $151,000. Difference, $196,000. At local land prices then averaging $4,100 per acre, that difference represented nearly 48 acres. The nephew did not ask again. By the harvest of 2011, Glenn had expanded his year-by-year records into a sequence that read like dry accounting and carried real strategic force. 2009, gross farm revenues $42,300, net after all operating costs and taxes $218,440. Capital purchases $22,600, all cash. 2010, gross $801,120, net $246,910. Land purchase 36 acres, $109,800 cash. 2011, gross $918,540. Net $311,760. Reserve account closed year at $402,000. 2012, drought pressure, cut yields. Gross $684,900. Net $141,220. No debt service required. 2013, gross $731,480. Net $167,300. Distressed parcel option funds set aside $520,000. 2014, commodity weakness continued. Gross $709,600. Net $152,040. 3 parcels purchased at sheriff sales, blended $3,240 per acre. That ledger sequence is the crux of his philosophy under stress. Revenue volatility is unavoidable in farming. Debt service volatility can be optional. Glenn selected the option he could survive. The social contrast sharpened in the same window, and this part matters because good families were caught in a system that rewarded leverage until conditions changed. Earl Bennett's variable rate package reset at the worst possible moment, and annual interest alone climbed above $143,000. Rosa and Miguel Alvarez carried payments calibrated to better yield years, then absorbed back-to-back weak seasons that erased margin. Tim Holloway's feed exposure and winter losses stacked into a burden he could not refinance. Denise Porter's input line required harvest cash flow that corn prices no longer supported. None of them were careless. They were operating inside prevailing advice that assumed stable prices and accommodating credit. When both moved the wrong way, their structures failed faster than their work ethic could compensate. Glenn attended those sales and bankruptcy hearings quietly when he could, often standing near the back rail with a paper cup of coffee gone cold. He bid only when he had already planned to hold the land long-term, and only at prices cash flow could support without optimistic commodity assumptions. On one parcel in late 2013, financed bidders were pre-approved but could not close by the court deadline when their banks tightened exposure. Glenn closed in 48 hours with cashier funds. He did not celebrate. He entered the acreage and tax parcel number in the ledger, then went home to change oil in the 4430. By the first week of May 2014, what looked from the road like stubborn frugality had become structural advantage. Owned acreage reached 1,140. Interest expense remained zero. Machinery remained old, fully paid, and serviceable. Liquidity remained strong enough to pre-buy fertilizer when winter discounts made sense. The truck still looked worn out in town parking lots. That visual never changed. The balance sheet kept changing anyway. Glenn spent the rest of that spring doing what he always did after a hard period, tightening the system instead of relaxing it. He split the farm into 5 cost zones, tracked each field's 3-year yield trend, and recalculated break-even by parcel rather than by whole operation. On better loam ground, his corn break-even landed near $3.21 per bushel. On thinner rented strips, it pushed to $3.88. That difference shaped planting decisions more than tradition ever had. He cut one underperforming rented tract, 72 acres at $248 per acre rent, because projected margin at expected yield and a $3.70 corn strip was only $19 per acre before labor. Keeping acres just to say he was bigger had never interested him. By October 2014, he had also formalized reserves into separate buckets with clear triggers. Tax and insurance reserve, target $75,000. Equipment replacement reserve, target $240,000. Land opportunity reserve, no fixed cap, but minimum floor $400,000. He moved grain hedging gains and above-trend yields into those buckets automatically. That single administrative change removed emotion from expansion. If land came up and the opportunity reserve could not absorb it while maintaining the floor, he did not bid. If equipment failed and repairs crossed 65% of replacement value for 2 seasons, he replaced with cash from the equipment reserve. There was no drama in those rules, just repetition. The ledger from 2015 through 2022 reads almost clinical, and that is precisely why it matters. 2015. Gross revenue $768,430. Net after operating costs and taxes $181,660. Purchased 54 acres at $3,680 per acre. Total $198,720 cash. Year-end reserves $711,000. 2016, gross $800, $2,910. Net $207,440. Replaced 1 failing grain leg motor and dryer controls, $18,640. No land purchase. Year-end reserves $800, $24,300. 2017, gross $800, $47,220. Net $200, $44,180. Bought adjoining 92 acres at $4,050 per acre. Total $372,600 cash. Sold obsolete implement line for $21,300. Year-end reserves $703,900 after purchase. 2018. Gross $889,760. Net $263,540. Added 38 acres from an estate at $4,220 per acre. Total $160,360 cash. Prepaid fertilizer for 2019 with 7.2% winter discount. Savings $31,480. 2019. Wet spring and delayed planting cut output. Gross $741,880. Net $132,970. No principal or interest burden, so no forced liquidation. Year-end reserves still $676,200. 2020. Yield recovery and discipline marketing. Gross $936,140. Net $289,600. Bought 120 acres at $4,480 per acre. Total $537,600 cash after two finance bidders withdrew at closing. 2021. Gross $1,028,500. Net $336,200. Capital repairs $42,700, including bin floor retrofit and combine transmission rebuild. No loans. Year-end reserves $782,400. 2022. Input costs surged and fuel pressure increased. Gross $1,164,300. Net $301,980 despite higher expenses. Purchased no land. Added $210,000 to liquidity to prepare for rate shocks and distressed opportunities. Across those 8 years, his gross revenue totaled $7,179,140, and net income totaled $1,957,570. Land purchases totaled $1,269,280, all cash. Repair and capital maintenance spending totaled $312,640. He ended the period with more acres, more liquidity, and no lender controlling his calendar. The core dynamics stayed unchanged. Conservative decisions during good years created optionality during bad ones. His machinery list looked almost absurd next to newer fleets, but the arithmetic favored him repeatedly. In 2016, he considered replacing an aging combine. Dealer quote for a newer financed unit was $329,000 at 5.8% for 7 years. Total payout near $400,680 before insurance increases. He passed and bought a 1998 model at auction for $41,200 cash, then spent $13,870 over 2 winters on augers, belts, and precision monitor updates. Total investment $55,070. Even adding higher annual maintenance, the 7-year ownership cost stayed under $96,000. Difference versus finance path, roughly $4,680. At local land values around $4,400 per acre at the time, that gap represented almost 69 acres. The same pattern held in trucks. In 2021, he rebuilt the Chevrolet engine and transmission for $8,940 and repainted only the hood to stop surface corrosion from spreading. New heavy-duty replacement quoted at $61,300 plus financing. He did not care that the rebuilt truck still looked tired in town. He cared that the decision preserved more than $50,000 for assets that appreciated instead of depreciated. Meanwhile, the neighbors who had expanded through debt were not caricatures of greed or carelessness. They were skilled operators working under a different framework, and when conditions turned, that framework amplified every shock. Earl Bennett had entered 2014 already stressed from variable rate resets. He attempted to restructure $1.6 million by extending term length and pledging additional collateral, including 2 grain bins and a 60-acre tract inherited from his mother. The restructured rate started at 7.9%, then moved above 9.2% as benchmarks rose. Annual debt service crossed $228,000, while his net operating margin in weaker years was less than half that. In 2016, he sold 1 combine and leased custom harvest work to survive. In 2017, he sold the inherited tract for $246,000, all proceeds absorbed by principal reduction and penalties. By 2018, he still could not close the gap. Foreclosure followed in stages. He lost the home place first, then operating control of most ground. He did not lose because he lacked discipline. He lost because a leveraged structure gave him no room when rates and prices moved together against him. Rosa and Miguel Alvarez fought longer than most because they cut family spending early and worked every available side contract. Their finance package, approximately $940,000 in land and equipment, had been built on assumptions of average yields and stable grain prices. They were strong managers, but 2 poor seasons, combined with machinery notes that did not pause for weather, pushed them into delinquency. They missed 3 payments, a lender workout bought 6 months, then failed when required collateral values were revised down. In 2019, 420 acres were auctioned in parcels. Rosa kept records in a yellow binder and could point to each month the cash flow narrowed. Their story was not mismanagement. It was non-trivial leverage, meeting non-cooperative conditions. Tim Holloway's losses came through a different channel. He carried about $780,000 tied to cattle, feed, and equipment, with a structure that relied on feed costs staying within a predictable band. They did not. A brutal winter raised consumption and mortality. Then feed prices spiked hard enough to erase projected margin. He refinanced once, then again, each time paying fees that bought time but not solvency. Bankruptcy court records later showed how narrow the margin had been, even in normal years. Tim was an attentive stockman. Debt converted one bad cycle into terminal strain. Denise Porter's line was smaller in absolute terms, roughly $510,000 tied to inputs and operations, but her vulnerability was timing. Her interest obligations clustered around harvest. When corn fell below her break-even and moisture discounts reduced delivered value, the harvest checks could not cover principal plus interest. She sold equipment, then leased custom work, then sold additional acreage to service balances. The operation shrank from survival strategy, not lack of effort. By the summer of 2018, the social atmosphere in county meetings had shifted from expansion talk to triage language. Bank officers attended with tighter underwriting sheets. Crop insurance meetings drew standing room crowds. Seed reps discussed financing programs alongside agronomy. Glenn sat through those same sessions with a small notebook and asked, mostly about cost sensitivity. He was not insulated from pain. Lower prices still reduced his revenue. Weather still cut yield. Diesel still hit his budget. But his fixed obligations were fundamentally different. In 2018, his property tax and insurance combined were under $68,000, and scheduled debt service was zero. Several neighbors entered each year owing $180,000 to $420,000 before a single gallon of fuel burned. Then the next stress wave arrived. In 2019, prolonged spring rain delayed planting windows and compacted fields that did get planted. County yield averages fell below trend. Glenn's corn on better drained parcels held near 154 bushels per acre, down from his prior 5-year average around 181. On weaker ground, some fields barely crossed 130. He cut discretionary repairs, deferred one non-essential building project, and drew $94,000 from reserves to keep input timing intact for the next cycle. Because he had no lender covenants, that drawdown was simply a management decision, not a distress signal. 3 years later, the pressure returned from the opposite direction. By March 2022, diesel had pushed above $4 per gallon locally, nitrogen prices were far above historical norms, and equipment parts carried longer lead times. The prevailing consensus said larger financed operations would absorb shocks through scale. In practice, scale under debt often meant larger absolute exposure. Glenn's total 2022 fertilizer and chemical bill still increased by more than $190,000 year over year, but he paid from cash and negotiated early buy discounts with immediate settlement. A leveraged operator paying 8% to 10% on operating lines absorbed the same input inflation plus financing cost. That spread widened quickly. By November 2022, interest rates had climbed enough that refinancing options tightened across the county. Two operators who had counted on rolling short-term notes into longer paper discovered their banks would not extend at prior terms. One sold machinery at year-end and took losses. Another surrendered rented ground to reduce exposure. Glenn did the opposite of what fear usually dictates. He increased liquidity, reduced discretionary spending again, and waited for forced sales where cash could close quickly and safely. Through all of it, he kept the same personal budget discipline that outsiders mistook for deprivation. Household spending in 2022 was $26,480, including utilities, groceries, insurance, and home maintenance. He still bought most clothes at farm surplus stores. He still packed lunch in the same metal box. He still parked the rusted Chevrolet where anyone could see it. Appearance stayed modest by choice, not necessity. By the first week of March 2023, his owned acreage stood at 1,404 acres, all debt-free, with additional rented ground managed conservatively. Grain marketing was hedged in layers, not guesses. Equipment replacement reserves were funded. Land opportunity cash exceeded $2,900,000. The structure he had built since a cold November in 1989 was no longer merely resilient. It was decisive. When strained markets demanded immediate cash and clean balance sheets, he could act while others were still waiting on credit committee calls. Within 2 weeks of that March threshold, the county rumor mill shifted from machinery talk to estate land because the Keller family had decided to liquidate a 600-acre block east of Riley with one hard condition attached to the auction terms. Same-day funding, no financing contingency, 10% earnest by close of business, full settlement in 30 days. Wade Mercer treated that clause as a gatekeeper that would screen out cash-poor bidders and protect his preferred buyer, a large, leveraged operation already carrying recent equipment notes through his dealership network. Glenn read the legal notice twice, wrote 4 numbers on his pad, and adjusted nothing about how he looked or how he moved through town. On May 9th, 2023, before Keller bidding opened, he quietly closed a separate 136-acre probate tract along the county line for cash, adding it to ground he already controlled, and moving owned acres from 1,404 to 1,540 with no note attached. The filing drew little attention because there was no public contest and no lender presentation, just recorded transfer and wire confirmation. By the second week of July 2023, he had already set his cap bid and funding stack. Grain sold forward and settled, $1,186,400. Land opportunity reserve after spring expenses, $2,947,300. Equipment reserve untouched at $268,000. Tax and insurance reserve intact at $92,000. He requested a cashier instrument in advance from First Prairie State Bank, not because he wanted spectacle, but because courthouse auctions reward preparation more than confidence. When the banker asked whether he wanted partial financing for liquidity flexibility, Glenn answered in one line, "No notes on dirt." The banker nodded, printed terms, and scheduled verification protocols for auction day. Before we go any further, if you want to see how this one auction turned into 6 young farms staying alive, subscribe now and stay with the arithmetic. because the numbers after the applause are where the real story sits. The Keller auction on August 18th opened under a white tent with folding chairs, two attorneys, and a clerk reading terms into a microphone that cut in and out with the wind. Wade stood near the front with his buyer and two lenders who had arrived with folders and measured optimism. Glenn stood near the side rail in faded overalls, cap brim sun-bleached, and boots still carrying field dust from morning checks. His 1991 Chevrolet sat crooked in the gravel beside late-model diesels with polished wheels. Nobody laughed openly this time, but several men looked at him the way people look at a familiar habit they assume cannot affect them. Bidding climbed in sharp increments. $2,300,000, $2,420,000, $2,510,000. At $2,620,000, one regional group dropped. At $2,700,000, Wade's buyer signaled for a pause and stepped back to call his bank contact again, then returned with tighter shoulders. The auctioneer restarted at $2,720,000. Glenn raised a hand once. $2,730,000 from the finance side. Glenn again. $2,740,000. The clerk waited. Wade's buyer asked for 3 minutes and did not get them. Terms were clear. The bank had reached exposure limits tied to existing leveraged equipment clients and would not extend additional same-day approval without collateral substitutions that could not be documented under tent conditions. Hammer down. Sold at $2,740,000 to Glenn Graham. The reveal was not cinematic. It was procedural, which made it heavier. Glenn walked to the table, presented a verified cashier check for the full 10% earnest requirement, $274,000, plus a bank letter confirming available liquid funds exceeding the remaining settlement obligation, and signed without flourish. The clerk checked routing verification by phone. The attorney initialed the margin and nodded settlement compliance. Wade read the letter twice, then handed it back with a face that had finally lost its sales posture. He did not argue. He simply stood still while the crowd recalibrated in silence. 3 days passed before the county recorder posted deed filings and local radio requested comment. Glenn declined an interview at first, then provided one factual statement to stop speculation that a hidden partnership had funded the bid. The statement included exact structure. 2,140 acres owned, all debt-free after Keller closing, no machinery notes, grain inventory hedged, cash reserves segmented by purpose. A local business reporter ran a valuation sidebar with conservative assumptions. Land at blended $4,950 per acre, $10,593,000. Grain and prepaid contracts, net mark value $1,248,000. Equipment line at auction equivalent value, $427,000. Cash and short instruments after closing, $744,000. Less deferred tax exposure and liabilities, $1,152,000. Estimated net worth, $11,860,000. The man many had tagged as marginal was one of the strongest private balance sheets in the county. The social reaction was muted, then respectful. Two operators who had once dismissed his methods asked for his cost templates. A banker who had declined him decades earlier mailed a note with 4 words, "You were right early." Wade's response came in public at a September farm meeting. He said he had underestimated cash discipline for 20 years and announced his dealership would expand used inventory, parts support, and repair contracts for older fleets instead of pushing every client toward maximum financed horsepower. It was not a dramatic apology. It was a business model correction under pressure from reality. Let me stop here and ask you something. If you had one good year, would you buy status or buy resilience? Put your answer in the comments, then watch what Glenn did next, because this is where quiet wealth becomes public good. Glenn did not convert revelation into lifestyle. He converted it into structure for other people. In October 2023, he met with a local attorney and created the Graham Field Foundation with a $3 million endowment funded from post-harvest settlements and short-term instruments. The charter was narrow by design, support debt-light starts for working farmers under 35 in Vigo and adjacent counties, prioritize applicants with documented cost control, and prohibit use of funds for personal vehicles or house upgrades. Endowment policy targeted 4.5% annual distribution, roughly $135,000 in normal years, with principal preservation rules that required reserve buffers before any expansion in grants. He added a separate personal loan pool outside the foundation so he could move faster than nonprofit cycles allowed. 6 zero-interest operating loans were issued at $120,000 each, total $720,000, all documented with simple terms. First principal payment due after second harvest, annual payment floor $20,000, no compounding interest, and one mandatory condition that each borrower mentor one newer grower within 3 years. Recipients were named, local and transparent: Elena Alvarez and Caleb Ruiz, Mara Lynn, Dustin Hale, Connor Voss, Priya Nand, and Jacob Morrow. 2 used the funds for seed and fertilizer prepay, 3 for leased acreage and working capital, 1 for livestock feed stabilization, with hedged purchase contracts. Delinquency at 12 months. 0. The equipment side came next. 12 grants averaged $18,500, total $222,000, each tied to a specific line item rather than a general check. Elena and Caleb received $21,400 for a no-till drill and monitor retrofit. Mara Lynn received $17,900 for irrigation, pump replacement, and electrical upgrades that cut seasonal energy waste. Dustin Hale received $18,200 for planter row unit rebuilds instead of a financed replacement. Connor Voss received $16,800 for grain handling safety and dryer control repairs. Priya Nand received $19,100 for fencing and water systems that lowered feed loss. The remaining 7 grants ranged from $15,600 to $19,400 for combines, wagons, and storage repairs that preserved cash flow without adding notes. Then came the land decision that carried the most emotional weight. Miguel Alvarez's daughter, Elena, and her husband, Caleb, had strong field skills, but no realistic path into ownership at prevailing prices near $6,000 per acre. Glenn sold them 160 acres at $4,200 per acre, total $672,000, with conventional title transfer and no hidden reversion clauses. At local comparables, the parcel could have brought about $968,000. The discount embedded a $296,000 wealth transfer without public ceremony. Elena and Caleb paired the purchase with one of the $120,000 zero-interest operating loans, kept machinery leased or used, and entered their first full season with land ownership and no machinery note. Their projected debt service load stayed under 1/3 of peers with similar acreage. If you are learning something from this, like the video and share it with one person who thinks income is the same thing as wealth. Glenn proved the difference with ledgers, not slogans. He did not forget the people who had gone through collapse years. Earl Bennett was hired as a paid agronomy scout on foundation-backed contracts at $58,000 annual salary plus mileage, then leased 70 acres under terms he could carry through weak commodity cycles. Rosa and Miguel leased back 90 acres through a 3-year stepping structure with rent tied to yield bands rather than fixed escalation, and they stayed current each quarter. Tim Holloway moved into feed yard management at cooperative scale with stable pay and no personal leverage exposure. Denise Porter rebuilt a 45-acre seed operation with a grant-assisted cleaning line and began mentoring beginning growers on input discipline. None of these outcomes erased prior loss. They restored forward motion. The deeper examination of Glenn's own arithmetic is where the philosophy stops sounding moral and starts sounding mechanical. From 1990 through 2023, his cumulative land purchases reached 2,140 acres through staggered cash acquisitions. Blended historical purchase basis across all parcels sat near $2,982 per acre, total basis about $6,381,480. Conservative 2023 valuation, near $4,950 per acre, produced land value $10,593,000, unrealized appreciation roughly $4,211,520 before taxes. During the same period, ledger analysis showed at least $2,436,000 in avoided interest expense from equipment and operating debt decisions he declined, calculated against documented prevailing rates and quoted alternatives. That avoided interest, reinvested into land and reserves, compounded into control. A year-by-year sequence from his internal review made that mechanism plain. 1989. Farmall purchase and repair. Total $661.73, including acquisition. First custom income stream established. 1993. First ownership parcel. 28 acres, $24,360 cash. 1998. Decline finance tractor. Avoided projected interest and overage. $22,344 against quoted terms. 2004. Added 110 acres, $211,200 cash, no lien. 2008. 612 owned acres, $184,000 reserves, 0 debt service. 2014, drought cycle survived with no forced liquidation. 3 distressed parcels bought at $3,240 per acre average. 2020, 120 acres added for $537,600 cash, while financed bidders withdrew. 2023, added 136 acres in May through probate sale, cash at close. Keller 600 acres acquired in August at $2,740,000 under same day funding terms. The recipient math followed the same discipline. Foundation endowment at $3 million with 4.5% distribution generated planned annual support near $135,000 without principal erosion in normal markets. Loan pool exposure of $720,000 at 0 interest carried opportunity cost, but default protection was built through conservative acreage caps and verified budgets. Equipment grants totaling $222,000 reduced recipient financing needs by multiples of that amount because each avoided note prevented added interest and forced replacement cycles. Elena and Caleb's 160-acre tract, purchased below market, gave them immediate equity that would have taken a decade to build under full-price leverage. By December 2024, internal tracking showed 6 of 6 zero-interest borrowers current, 12 of 12 equipment grant recipients operating without new machinery notes, and household stability restored across every named casualty from the earlier debt wave. Glenn still parked the same rusted Chevrolet outside the same supply stores. He still answered financing questions in short lines. Show me total cost, show me downside. Then he would fold the paper, put it in his coat, and go back to work. December 2024 closes with every zero-interest borrower current and every grant recipient operating without a new machinery note, so the winter planning cycle rolls straight into execution instead of cleanup. On the first Monday of February 2025, the foundation board sits at Glenn's kitchen table with legal pads, coffee rings on old oak, and a 12-column tracking sheet that treats hope like an operating budget. The first review shows the loans are not merely current. They are compounding into independent balance sheets. By the end of that meeting, Elena Alvarez and Caleb Ruiz's Year 1 file is open on top of the stack. On 160 acres, they post corn at 186 bushels per acre and soybeans at 57, using mostly repaired equipment and custom hire only where ownership makes no sense. Gross farm revenue lands at $312,440. Net after inputs, rent on an additional 40 leased acres, taxes and household draw is $96,380. They send $24,000 on the zero-interest note ahead of schedule and set aside $31,000 in working capital. Through 2025 and into 2026, they add 60 leased acres, then reject pressure to buy a newer planter, putting $14,800 into rebuild parts instead of signing a $118,000 note. Their debt service stays predictable, and by late 2026, their land and retained earnings put equity above $1,420,000. In March 2025, Mara Lynn draws from her $120,000 operating loan and pairs it with the $17,900 equipment grant to stabilize a mixed vegetable and grain rotation that had been swinging cash flow month to month. She replaces failing pumps, insulates 2 storage bays, and renegotiates seed timing around early pay discounts. Her energy costs drop 18.6% in the first season. Spoilage drops from 11.2% to 3.9%. Over the next 2 crop cycles, she moves from 74 acres managed to 210 through disciplined leases, all short-term, and all inside a cap she sets at 28% of trailing gross revenue. By the end of 2026, she has repaid $40,000 in principal and holds $412,000 in net equity with no machinery lien. Dustin Hale becomes the clearest example of avoiding a trap in real time. In spring 2025, 2 lenders offer equipment packages that would push annual fixed obligations above $62,000. Glenn's grant of $18,200 for row unit rebuilds and a $120,000 operating line lets Dustin keep annual fixed obligations at $19,400 while lifting planting accuracy enough to raise yield on his core ground by 9 bushels per acre. He expands from 130 acres to 390, then buys 42 acres at $5,080 per acre with 35% down and a short 5-year note he can extinguish early. In October 2026, he writes a final payment check and clears the lien 2 years ahead of schedule. In June 2025, Connor Voss installs the grant-funded grain handling and dryer control rebuild that had been sitting on his punch list for 2 seasons. Harvest bottlenecks ease, forced discounted sales stop. And in the first season, after repairs, his average basis improves by 18 cents per bushel because he can hold and dry on his own schedule. That single line item adds $27,900 to annual margin at his volume. He stays conservative, keeps one hired hand instead of three, and moves from 160 acres to 320. His zero-interest loan balance drops from $120,000 to $68,000 by mid-2026. Priya Nan puts her grant to work through summer 2025, targeting lower feed loss and better water reliability across rotational grazing paddocks. Feed waste falls from 14% to 6%. Vet and stress-related losses drop enough to stabilize cash flow in winter, the period that had broken Tim Holloway years earlier. She does not expand fast. She expands correctly, from 95 acres to 180, then builds a cash buffer equal to 9 months of operating costs before taking any additional lease. Her loan principal stands at $74,000 by the last quarter of 2026, current and never late. Jacob Morrow enters 2025, one machinery failure, away from shutting down custom hay work, then uses his operating loan to lock feed inventory and replace only the components that directly affect uptime. His utilization rate climbs from 63% to 87%. He hires 2 seasonal workers at fair wages, then mentors 1 high school graduate into a full-time operator role with profit share on custom contracts. By 2026, he manages 240 acres directly and services another 1,100 in custom work without over-leveraging his own books. The cascade matters as much as each individual recovery. The charter requirement that every borrower mentor someone newer is dismissed at first as paperwork language. By August 2026, it is the multiplier. Those 6 primary borrowers have formally mentored 18 additional operators. 12 of the 18 adopt written reserve thresholds modeled after Glenn's system. 9 open separate tax and insurance reserve accounts. 7 cancel planned machinery financing after running total cost comparisons. Collectively, foundation recipients and second-wave mentees manage 3,480 acres with combined equity, estimated above $17,400,000, aligning almost exactly with Glenn's projection. One disciplined endowment becomes a local risk reduction network. The older casualties move from survival into stability, with dignity intact. Earl Bennett's agronomy scout role expands into a 3-county route at $64,500 salary, plus vehicle allowance, and his 70 rented acres produce positive margin for 3 consecutive seasons. He never regains his old footprint, but he regains sleep and control. Rosa and Miguel Alvarez stay current on every quarter under their yield band lease and rebuild household savings to $58,000 by late 2026. Tim Holloway remains feed yard manager on a steady salary, no personal leverage, and 1 rebuilt retirement account funded automatically each month. Denise Porter's 45-acre seed operation becomes a teaching site for new growers, and she logs 312 mentorship hours in 2026 alone, mostly on cost control and timing discipline. November 2025 turns Wade Mercer's business into the 2nd case study in public adaptation. He reduces new high-horsepower inventory exposure by 37%, expands certified used units, and builds a winter rebuild program with transparent parts and labor pricing. Service bay utilization rises from 61% to 89%, giving the dealership steadier cash flow than commission spikes from large finance packages. He stops using urgency language in sales meetings and starts showing side-by-side lifetime cost sheets, including interest sensitivity at multiple rate paths. Some competitors call that defensive. Wade calls it accurate. His relationship with Glenn changes without becoming friendship theater. They are not close, they are professional. Glenn buys parts, occasionally sells trade-in equipment through Wade's lot, and declines every invitation to sit on dealership marketing panels. In March 2026, at a county equipment forum with about 140 attendees, Wade gives the line people remember because it is unvarnished. I sold payments as progress. He sold control as survival. The room goes quiet, then people write it down. Mercer Ag Supply stays in business, leaner and more useful, and Wade retires from day-to-day management in late 2026, with his daughter running operations under the revised model. By spring 2026, roll call in Vigo County sounds different than it did 3 years earlier because the names no longer end in court dates. Elena and Caleb are farming full-time and current. Mara is expanding within limits and current. Dustin is lean-free on his purchase tract and current. Connor is current. Priya is current. Jacob is current. Earl is housed, employed, and farming a size he can carry. Rosa and Miguel are current and rebuilding. Tim is stable and debt-light. Denise is profitable, mentoring and current. Wade is still local, adjusted, and no longer selling maximum leverage as default wisdom. Glenn remains exactly where most people first misread him. Same modest farmhouse. Same 1991 Chevrolet with the odometer still frozen and the body still rough around both rear fenders. In June 2026, he replaces brake lines for $640 and front suspension components for $1,180, then drives it back to the field like any other day. The 1953 Farmall Super M remains under the lean-to, restored, started monthly, and used for light auger duty and one local fair demonstration each summer where he spends more time answering maintenance questions than telling personal history. The John Deere 4430 is finally retired from primary tillage after another hydraulic issue, not scrapped, just cleaned, serviced, and parked in the machine shed as backup. Old equipment maintained with respect. Outlives forecasts and finance sales cycles alike. His nephew, now running much of day-to-day scheduling, keeps the ledger architecture intact and digitizes every binder back to 1989, including Mabel Klein's condition, written into that 11-acre deed. The original notebook with the $175 Farmall entry sits in a fireproof box, pages brittle but readable. The first arithmetic line still anchoring the whole framework. Glenn reviews numbers every Sunday evening, still separating reserves by purpose, still refusing to blur household spending with operating liquidity. His 2026 household budget closes at $28,140, modest against his net worth and entirely intentional. By the last week of October 2026, sunset comes early across harvested ground east of Riley, and Glenn stands beside the old Farmall while cooling metal clicks under the lean-to roof. No crowd, no speech. Just a man in faded work clothes looking over paid-for land assembled acre by acre from discipline most people never noticed while it was happening. The county once judged him by rust, patches, and a truck that looked one season from retirement. The books tell a different story from the start. Debt is the real predator. Cash discipline is the shield. And the wealth that looked invisible from the road does its final work in public, making other families harder to break. The next Tuesday, just after dawn in January 2027, Glenn set the old oak table with 12 folders, one calculator, and a yellow envelope that had 1989 written across the flap in block letters. Frost held at the window edges. Coffee steamed between them. Elena and Caleb arrived first, boots still carrying feed dust. Then Mara, Dustin, Connor, Priya, Jacob, and finally Earl with a clipboard full of soil notes from his scout route. Glenn did not open with philosophy. He opened with numbers. "Loan roll call," he said. Elena answered first. "Principal down to $62,000. Never late." Caleb slid over their sheet. Gross revenue for 2026 had reached $418,770 across owned and leased ground. Net after all operating costs, family draw, and tax set-asides was $128,440. They had prepaid seed at a 6.1% discount and kept machinery repairs at $19,320 by rebuilding instead of replacing. Mara's page showed 210 acres managed, gross $389,200, net $104,780, with spoilage still below 4% and reserve cash equal to 8 months of operating expense. Dustin showed the shortest line of all. Loan balance, $0. He had paid off the remaining principal in November 2026, then opened a tax reserve account with $27,000 to avoid borrowing for spring inputs. Connor reported $44,000 left, and a basis improvement that held through a second harvest. Priya reported $51,000 left, feed loss steady under 6.5%, and no winter credit line draw. Jacob reported $39,000 left, and custom work contracts signed through the coming summer. By mid-February 2027, the board approved a second cycle. 4 new zero-interest loans at $90,000 each, and 8 targeted repair grants totaling $146,000, funded from endowment distribution, plus recovered principal from the first 6 borrowers. The structure had become self-reinforcing, exactly as designed. Money returned, skills multiplied, stress dropped. The required mentoring clause, once treated as paperwork, had turned into the core asset. On a windy March evening in the machine shed, Elena stood beside a whiteboard and walked 6 newer operators through her exact prepay worksheet. Projected acres, input timing, discount windows, and a red column labeled, "What breaks if yield drops 15%. Glenn stayed by the heater and listened. He spoke once when one young renter asked whether a large machinery note might still make sense for image and efficiency. "Image does not pay notes," Glenn said. "Margin does." In April, the foundation's internal audit was completed by an outside accounting firm from Indianapolis at the board's request. Clean opinion. Endowment value, $3,286,400 after distributions and market movement. Loan pool outstanding, $196,000 across original 6 borrowers and $360,000 across the second cycle. Delinquency, 0. Aggregate acres managed by direct recipients and mentees, 3,742. Estimated combined equity, $18,930,000. The multiplier effect was no longer projection. It was measured. Wade Mercer's resolution arrived without drama, which suited the truth better than any grand scene. On June 3, 2027, Mercer Ag Supply held an open house under clear skies with used tractors lined in one row and rebuilt engines on stands with tags showing parts and labor cost. Wade's daughter, Lila Mercer, now ran day-to-day operations and had changed the sales board. Every quote included total payout under 3 rate scenarios, not only monthly payment. Glenn walked in wearing the same faded coat and handed over an alternator core from the 4430. Wade met him near the counter. "Got a minute?" Wade asked. They stood by a display of rebuilt hydraulic pumps while customers moved around them. "At Keller, when my buyer stepped away," Wade said, eyes on the concrete floor. "He was calling for a last-minute extension. Bank said no. I kept thinking they would bend. They did not." He looked up then, the old certainty absent but not replaced by self-pity. "I should have taught people stress math years earlier." Glenn nodded once. "You are teaching it now." That was the whole exchange. No reconciliation speech. No theater. Wade retired fully in November 2027, stayed on 1 day a week for inventory review, and left the business solvent and useful under Lila's model. The critic who once sold urgency now sold durability, and the county was better for it. The physical records that had carried Glenn's life began moving from private storage to permanent archive that same year. His nephew, with Glenn's approval, scanned every ledger binder from 1989 forward into redundant digital storage, then printed annual bound copies for the Foundation office. The yellow envelope marked 1989 was opened in front of the board. Inside sat the first notebook page, Farmall Super M, bought for $175. Repair outlay, $486.73. They framed a copy for the training room. The original returned to the fireproof box in Glenn's bedroom closet. Mabel Klein's receipt book, which had sat for years in the desk drawer, was donated to the Vigo County Historical Society with a short note from Glenn. "She taught cost discipline before I had land." The curator logged it as a permanent gift and placed it in climate storage. Even small, strange details were finally settled. The Chevrolet odometer was still frozen at 312,406. In August 2027, a mechanic offered to replace the cluster. Glenn declined and kept recording mileage by service log as he had for years. Rust remained on both rear fenders. Brake lines were new. Engine was sound. Appearance still misled strangers in parking lots, and he no longer bothered correcting them. By October 2027, roll call at the annual Foundation supper was read aloud with each name and status, because Glenn insisted that outcomes be documented, not implied. Elena Alvarez and Caleb Ruiz, current, profitable, expanding only within reserve targets. Mara Lynn, current, profitable, training 2 apprentices. Dustin Hale, loan repaid, land lien-free, mentoring 3 operators. Connor Voss, current, basis gains sustained, no machinery note. Priya Nand, current, livestock margins stable, reserve account fully funded. Jacob Morrow, current, custom, business profitable, 2 full-time employees with benefits. Earl Bennett, employed, housed, farming 70 acres, current on all obligations. Rosa and Miguel Alvarez, current, leasing 90 acres, household savings rebuilt and rising. Tim Holloway, cooperative feed, yard manager, stable salary, no personal leverage. Denise Porter, profitable on 45 acres, mentorship program at capacity. Wade Mercer, retired from daily operations, dealership transition, model changed. Lila Mercer, operating owner, transparent, cost-based sales system. Mabel Klein, deceased in 2003, records preserved. Condition on 11-acre deed still honored. Glenn's own status was read last and shortest. Still farming, still debt-free, still giving. By the second week of May 2028, corn stood knee-high on the better ground east of Riley, and the Farmall started on the second pull of the choke at the county fair demonstration. Children climbed the fence for a closer look at a machine built before their grandparents were born. Glenn answered questions about magnetos, fuel mix, and tire ballast, then stepped aside so his nephew could demonstrate the same maintenance checklist he had used for 30 years. Old iron still worked. The farm still operated. The system still held. The closing truth stayed plain enough to fit on one ledger line. Glenn had been judged by rust, patched sleeves, and a truck that looked tired. Reality sat in paid acres, separated reserves, and zero interest expense through bad cycles that broke stronger-looking operations. He never used wealth to win arguments. He used it to lower failure rates for other families. At sunset that evening, he stood under the lean-to with one hand on the Super M's fender while cooling metal clicked in small, steady sounds. Behind him were fields paid in full, records in order, people accounted for, and a county that had learned to read balance sheets before paint. The man thrown out with $42 had finished the work completely, acre by acre, and left the ground stronger than he found it.